Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 9 about civil rights. It's Lesson 8 about other voting rights. In this lesson, you'll learn about the women's suffrage movement, about the 19th Amendment, the 26th Amendment, about motor voter, and about voter identification laws. Well, we spent a lot of time in this unit talking about the civil rights movement, which we characterized as the movement toward getting equal rights for Black Americans. We don't want to fail to acknowledge the women's suffrage movement. It was a mass movement in the United States of America, sort of a groundswell of support that came up in a big civil rights issue prior to the civil rights movement. In some ways, it was an example that the civil rights movement could build upon. It was the women's suffrage movement was primarily concerned with pursuing the woman's right to vote, although there were broader implications about equality between men and women. The women's suffrage movement, by putting mass pressure on the government of the United States of America through demonstrations like the one in this photo and other political tactics, eventually succeeded in getting women the right to vote. This came with the 19th Amendment, which was passed in the year 1920. So it's kind of amazing to think about as of the time that I'm making this recording. It's been less than 100 years since women in the United States of America had the right to vote. Before that, they were unable to. But the 19th Amendment prohibited discriminating on account of race in determining who could vote in the United States of America. Another big social issue that arose in America during the 20th century revolved around the war in Vietnam. There were a lot of protests against the war, a lot of negativity, particularly towards the draft. The draft is where people were chosen to go and serve in the armed forces, whether they wanted to or not. Young men were required to register for the draft, and then through a certain process, which wasn't exactly random, some were picked to go and some weren't. And you had protests against this. One of the particular line of thoughts that protests could take was the fact that you had young men, 18, 19 years old, being sent off to fight in Vietnam. But at the time, they were not allowed to vote. You were not considered to be an adult for purposes of exercising the right to vote until you reached the age of 21. Yet somehow, at the age of 18 or 19 or 20, you were old enough to go fight and die for your country. Well, this incongruity bothered people. It bothered people enough that rather than getting rid of the draft for the 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, they decided to change the Constitution to make sure that people from those age groups could vote. And that happened with passage of the 26th Amendment, which declared that anyone 18 years of age or older could not be denied the right to vote in the United States of America. Now, just being told that you have the right to vote as a woman or as an 18-year-old or as a black man or whatever it may be, doesn't necessarily mean, though, that you're going to be able to vote. Because the United States of America, voting is typically a two-stage process. The first is that you have to register to vote. You have to let the election officials in the place that you live know that you live there and that you want to participate in the election in some way. America being a land built on federalism with different states, but a land in which people are mobile and move from one state to another, needs to have some system of keeping track of where people are living and where they should be voting. Otherwise, you could have people vote in multiple places at a time. Rather than just casting one vote for president, maybe they could cast 3 or 4, for example. So the system of registration was set up to try to make sure that the right people are voting in the right places. But registration is potentially a discouragement to voting. It adds an extra step to the process, an extra step that people don't think of before the election because registration needs to be taken care of ahead of time. And so, in some ways, people argued it suppressed the vote. To deal with that, in 1993, a law was passed that became commonly known as motor voter. What it simply did was require states, when they are giving people's driver's licenses, they have to offer them the opportunity to register to vote at that time at whatever address they're putting on their driver's license. This had a big effect to make registration easier, to increase the number of Americans that were registered to vote, to give more people the opportunity to vote. At the same time that laws like Motor Voter were trying to give more people the opportunity to vote, other laws about voter identification, at least in some people's minds, are being put in place to reduce the number of people voting. Voter identification simply requires you, before you cast a ballot, to prove that you are the person that's registered that's supposed to be casting that ballot. Now, it actually may surprise many people to find out that there are lots of states in the United States of America that don't require any sort of identification. But there are also many that do. Those who support the idea of voter ID laws point out that, first of all, it can help prevent fraud. If you have to actually show an ID, then you can't go in and vote in place of somebody else. And there have been various activists that have actually staged things where they've went in and got a hold of other people's ballots, that sort of thing, just to prove that it's possible without voter ID laws to go in and cheat a great deal in the election if you wanted to and you were organized to do it. They also point out that there are much less important activities in the big scheme of our way of government, much less important activities that routinely require voter identification. Just for example, purchasing cigarettes. You can't do that unless you show ID to prove your age. So they say, why should you have to show ID to do all these other things? Make a credit card transaction, rent a car, whatever it is. Do all these other things. Why should you be required to show an ID for those, but not required to show an ID for casting a vote for President of the United States? But there are still critics of voter ID laws. And what they claim is that requiring identification has a disproportionate effect on certain groups that are less likely to have IDs. They say that the elderly, the poor, and minority voters are less likely to have identification. And so the voter ID laws end up having a biased effect by preventing more of these people to vote while allowing more from other groups. Now, it so happens that these groups that they're complaining about being more affected by voter ID laws also happen to most often vote for Democratic candidates. So this debate over voter ID laws has actually become quite partisan. The Democratic Party, seeing it having more likely in their view to have an effect on people who would probably be their voters if they weren't inhibited by this law, they oppose these laws. While the Republicans, who, again, seeing this more likely to affect Democratic voters, support the laws. Now, they both make principled arguments. The Republicans will say, hey, we're just trying to prevent voter fraud, which is a real possibility. While the Democrats will say, well, this is discriminatory against these groups. But really what it probably comes down to, for the most part, is a partisan disagreement. They each see it as potentially helping or hurting voters that could help or hurt them win elections. So now, let's review what we learned in this lesson. What did the women's suffrage movement want? Did it want women to be able to go to war? Did it want women to be able to use birth control? Did it want women to be able to go to work? Or did it want women to be able to vote? What the women's suffrage movement wanted was for women to get to vote. What did the 19th Amendment do? Did it allow all races to vote? Did it allow women to vote? Did it allow 18-year-olds to vote? Or did it allow non-citizens to vote? The 19th Amendment allowed women to vote. What did the 26th Amendment do? Did it allow all races to vote? Did it allow women to vote? Did it allow 18-year-olds to vote? Or did it allow non-citizens to vote? The 26th Amendment allowed 18-year-olds to vote. What did the motor voter law require? Did it allow you to stay registered to vote even when you move? Did it allow you to register to vote when getting a driver's license? Did it allow you to vote at any voting location? Or did it allow you to vote by mail? Motor voter allows a person to register to vote when getting their driver's license. What is the purpose of voter identification laws? Is it to allow immigrants to vote? Is it to prevent voters from moving? Is it to collect more taxes? Or are they to prevent voter fraud? The stated purpose of voter identification laws is to prevent voter fraud. All right, that completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 9. It'll be Lesson 9, and it'll ask the question if, are civil rights absolute?